Warning. The following episode of Talks from the Crypt contains explicit and disturbing content. This includes discussions of violence, crime, and the darkest elements of the human psyche. If you find such topics unsettling, or if you are not of an appropriate age, we strongly urge you to consider skipping this episode. Your discretion is strongly advised.
He hasn't spoken a word.
Hello, creeps. It's your old pal, the Crypt Keeper. And you are now tuned in to my good fiends at Talks from the Crypt, the most gruesome podcast in the world.
Today in the Crypt, we have a very special guest. Some people call him the Dean of True Crime. Others have called him America's principal chronicler of its greatest psychopathic killers, the maestro of murder, the sultan of serial killers, and I've got 12 more.
Really? Oh, wow. I've never heard of all those. Obviously, I'm very pleased to be known by those titles.
A lot of them were on Reddit. You can name it.
Cool.
But Harold, so thank you so much for joining us in the Crypt today. We had a little bit of unforeseen circumstances with the neon sign.
Yeah, like small accidents seem to be happening wherever I go recently. No, I somehow slammed my apartment door on the tip of my finger, but I'm okay. Even though I have to go see a hand surgeon,
Well,
and then as soon as I come here, your sign breaks.
Yeah.
So something's going on.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on, man. But you said earlier that things happen in threes, so let's hope the house doesn't explode while we're doing the podcast.
Yeah, or like that big light doesn't fall on our heads and kill us.
Right. Well, actually, we did put a safety wire up there, so it won't happen.
Yeah.
So first off, congrats on the release. When did this just came out today, right?
I think it was published officially yesterday.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, take a gander. Murderabilia by Harold Schechter, his latest work, A History of Crime in 100 Objects. I tried my hardest to read this. Your team reached out, sent me an advance copy a couple of weeks ago, and I learned through this book that I was a slow reader. Thankfully, I was already familiar with your work because of Deviant, but we're going to get into that later because I think Murderabilia is a really interesting concept. So in your definition, what, for people who might not know the term, what is Murderabilia?
Well, Murderabilia is a term that was coined by a guy named Andy Kahan, who is kind of a victim's advocate who works with the Houston Police Department, and who is very indignant over the existence of it. But what it refers to is collectible items related to infamous and sensational murders. In a kind of sense, as I talk about in the introduction to my book, sort of unholy relics of sensational murders, mostly.
That was one of my favorite lines of the book. I forgot who it was, but you said if the pinky of Saint.
Yeah.
I don't want to repeat
it.
Which
Saint.
It was great. Sergius, I think, or is it Sergius? You never know how those names are pronounced.
No, all those funny foreign names. Yeah, well, I mean, what I say in the book is, a lot of these collectibles, a lock of Charles Manson's hair, for example, they're kind of the shadow side of saints' relics, in the way that saints' relics seem to somehow embody a certain kind of sacred power. These objects, which were connected to, touched by, owned by, sometimes, again, actual body parts of the serial killers, have this unholy power. They seem to resonate with this malevolence, this evil that, as I said, is the dark underside of a saintly relic, but that, again, exerts its own kind of fascination.
Mm-hmm. Did you pick the items first and then write the stories based on that, or did you know the stories and then hunt for the item?
A little bit of both. I mean, there were definite stories I knew I had to include. there were certain cases where there was a story I might have wanted to write about, but there was no kind of satisfactory object that I could use as a springboard to talk about that story. So, yeah, for the most part, the stories came first. Though there were, in the course of my research, I did get to know some Murderabilia collectors, and, they sometimes had objects that were so fascinating, I felt I had to include them and then write the story that they were connected to.
Mm-hmm.
So,
when you get as early back to the 1800s and you have this item, how easy is it to get those stories? I mean, is it all folklore at that point, or are you getting as thorough research as you do with, something as popular as Gein?
Well, first of all, let me say that collecting Murderabilia dates way farther back than the early 1800s. Back in the 1700s and even the 1600s, one of the perks of being an executioner was that, for example, hangmen in the 1700s and 1800s, one of the perks was they got to keep the noose that they hanged the victim from, and they would cut the noose up into 1-inch pieces and sell them as souvenirs. There are many recorded instances of convicts, famous convicts, being executed by beheading, for example, in which spectators would come and dip their handkerchiefs into the blood and keep that as souvenirs. So, again, many people, I remember years and years ago, one of the earliest entries on true crime in Wikipedia said that the genre started with Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, which was basically off by 300 years.
Man, so what was the first?
Well, I mean, the earliest true crime book, which basically was printed not long after Gutenberg invented movable type. Well, I guess he didn't invent movable type, but he invented the printing press. Was a true crime book about notorious British murderers. It was called something like God's Revenge. Back then, and to some extent even now, true crime was offered with this overlay of moral edification. You were supposedly reading about the bad ends that these killers came to as a way of learning virtuous behavior so that you would not make the mistakes that led them to their dreadful ends. And it was published around Shakespeare's time. One of the first books to come off the printing press in the United States was a true crime book. The Puritans, when they settled here, the English Calvinists, when they came over here from England, what we know as the Pilgrim Fathers, would publish what they call these gallows sermons. Whenever they had to execute a criminal, the criminal was supposed to make a confession right before he was hanged, and there would be some accompanying sermon by one of the ministers, and they would be published in these pamphlets. And again, they were essentially, the Puritan version of true crime literature. So that phenomenon goes way, way back. And even before the Gutenberg press, when a very sensational crime happened, it would be transmitted orally through what were called murder ballads. So the fascination with gruesome crime is an age-old, perennial human phenomenon. Nothing new about that. And by the same token, this urge, this morbid urge, whatever the impulse is, I think it's complicated, to own, some kind of souvenir of this terrible crime goes way, 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 way back. Like everything else, the only thing that's changed is technology, right? Instead of murder ballads or early printed ballads or early crime pamphlets, now we get this stuff on, true crime podcasts and, Netflix series and things like that. So it's just the way these stories are transmitted that's changed. but not the urge either to hear the stories or somehow to be directly connected to them, by owning some piece of memorabilia that is connected to the crime.
Yeah. Do you see any kind of moral issues with people who go out of their way to collect it?
What's interesting to me is the way people rationalize their fascination with true crime. If you ask somebody, this has happened to me on many occasions, having this discussion, why are you so fascinated with, reading about Ted Bundy or hearing, seeing a documentary about Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy, blah, blah. People usually rationalize that. Well, I want to learn the psychology of serial killers. They're always offering an explanation that casts themselves in the best light somehow. My feeling is it's important for all of us to acknowledge the darker side of our natures, what the psychologists Carl Jung call the shadow side of our natures. There is a part of us. I believe very strongly that we have evolved, that we're an innately violent species, that we have evolved from primates who were and still are very, very violent. We share more DNA with chimpanzees than chimpanzees do with gorillas. And chimpanzees are insanely violent creatures. There's a great book about it called Demonic Males by a Harvard primatologist named Richard Wrangham. It talks about how chimpanzees commit atrocities that are like those perpetrated by human serial killers. So that's part of who and what we are. And there's always going to be some need to feed that, what the philosopher William James called the carnivore within. And we have constructed a civilization that allows us to satisfy those dark impulses, in a safe and, in our capitalist society, economically profitable way. But people are always going to be drawn to that. So yeah, I don't regard the urge to collect that stuff as, morally indefensible or whatever.
When I was reading the book, one of the more fascinating things about it to me, aside from how far back some of these things had gone, were the music ballads that you brought up earlier.
Yeah.
And how upbeat some of these songs would sound for such horrible things.
Yeah. So I'm a baby boomer. And of course, I grew up during the big folk music craze of the late 50s and 60s. And funnily, I was just thinking about this today for some reason, but the group that sparked that whole folk music craze, which ultimately gave us Bob Dylan and Joan Baez and people like that, was a trio called the Kingston Trio. These three guys, very clean cut. They always wore the same kind of khaki pants and striped shirts. But their first big hit, and it was a song that really got the folk music boom of the late 50s and early 60s going, was a song called Tom Dooley, which I could sing for you, but my wife's always telling me what a bad voice I have. But the lyrics go, hang down your head, Tom Dooley, hang down your head and cry, hang down your head, Tom Dooley, poor boy, you're bound to die. I met her on the mountain, there I took her life, met her on the mountain, stabbed her with my knife. And this was a huge hit. And again, it made the Kingston Trio big, big stars. They were on the cover of Life magazine, sold millions of records. And it was a murder ballad. It was a song that was actually based on a true murder that happened. And again, it became this huge popular hit all across the country. So again, point being, that's a genre that has existed for a very, very long time, that human beings have always somehow, well, at least in our culture, responded to and, would buy sheet music for or recordings of. It really lasted way into the 20th century. Nick Cave, the great Australian singer-songwriter, has produced an album called Murder Ballads, kind of reviving that tradition. But yeah, I mean, it demonstrates, among other things, how the fascination with true crime is this age-old phenomenon that is always, certainly in Western culture, attracted a very large audience.
And when you were thinking about writing a book telling the history of crime in 100 Objects, I mean, what exactly was the inspiration? Like, how did that idea come about?
Well, it actually came about because there is a whole category of books. Years ago, an author whose name I have forgotten wrote a book called The History of the World in 100 Objects. And that set off, created this whole genre, a history of the United States in 100 Objects, a history of Shakespeare in 100 Objects. So at some point I thought, well, there should be a history of murder in 100 Objects.
Yeah.
And so that was the basic inspiration for the idea.
Yeah.
Writing something in that kind of publishing category.
That sounds so fun, just as a project to be able to think like, how many different objects can I choose throughout time? That's...
Yeah. Well, I mean, part of the problem was finding the objects or finding photographs of the objects. There are a lot of things I would have liked to include, which I couldn't get hold of. Some things I wanted to include that I couldn't get permission to use the photographs
Like
of.
what?
Well, I can't really, in a way, it's hard for me to talk about that because I think the people who own the objects wouldn't want to have them identified. So, but there were one or two objects that again, because the owner felt, again, perfectly justified from his or her point of view, that these were being exploited for some sort of sensationalistic purpose.
Yeah.
Didn't want to be part of it.
Well, that's great. It leaves suspense.
Yeah.
Now people could guess and put your guesses in the comments. That was one of my questions, though. Was there any items that you wanted in the book but didn't end up putting in there because it didn't make the cut?
Yeah, there were one or two, we tried to make there's some very, very disturbing objects out there. Obviously, crime. I had a crime scene photo of when I think I include Earl Leonard Nelson. Earl Leonard Nelson was this early 20th century serial murderer who roamed all over the country and finally made his way up into Canada, strangling, I can't remember the number, but it was at least 24 landladies. He would show up some city and walk around until he saw a room to let sign in a window, and he would go in, and if the landlady was unmarried and there weren't a lot of people around, shouldn't have a husband or grown children, he would rent a room, and he'd present himself as this respectable young man, who was well versed in the Bible, which he was, and he would strangle her and rape her. Usually the rape would be post-mortem.
Jesus.
And anyway, I mean, there are some very gruesome crime scene photographs of some of his victims. Mm-hmm. Things like that. Although, they are of some interest if you're a scholar of American serial murder. Just didn't seem appropriate to put in a book like this. So.
Yeah. One of the more interesting items that I read in the book was Augusta Gein's Crucifix.
Yes.
And I have a buddy who knows the guy who owns it, I believe. Okay. What was the guy's name who has that? Or does he not want to be known?
Yeah, I'm not sure he wants to be known.
Okay, yeah, let's leave that private. But I think I know the guy who owns it.
Okay.
And I had a question because in Deviant, a part of your book has all of the items that were listed for auction. Mm-hmm. And it included the car and a bunch of other stuff.
Yeah.
But the crucifix wasn't listed. And I'd think that would be fairly important to put in that.
Well, I mean, they were auctioning farm implements. And of course, as you know, the local townspeople burned down Eddie's house because they were afraid, justifiably, that it was going to become this morbid tourist attraction. So, and a lot of personal, objects were lost in that fire. I mean, I'm assuming, well, you've seen pictures of what Ed Gein's house looked like. There was all kinds of stuff in there.
What's funny is I'm more familiar with your description of it than the pictures.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, they weren't auctioning. First of all, nobody imagined at the time, that Ed Gein was going to become this sort of mythical figure. So nobody was auctioning off, family albums or anything like that. But Ed, retained possession of his mother's crucifix. And as I have been told the story and have seen evidence of, when he was institutionalized, he became close to somebody through this correspondence. They established this close epistolary relationship. And at some point, Ed, by way of acknowledging his gratitude to this correspondent, sent him his mother's crucifix, Augusta's crucifix, I think maybe as a Christmas gift, which was accompanied by a card or a letter, which I've seen an image of. I haven't seen it in person. And this friend of mine, who was a serious collector, Murderabilia, I think he's disposed of a lot of his collection by now, got to know this correspondent of Ed Gein's and purchased the letter and the crucifix from him. So
do you know how much for?
No. He might have told me, but anyway, yeah, there's no question as to its authenticity.
Yeah. Yeah, see, it's an odd thing for me because I always start with like a skeptic mind, especially when it starts to trace back that far. Ed Gein, that whole case happened in the 50s. And it was surprising because, there were movies coming out. There was a ton of things going on in the 50s. But for some reason, Ed Gein's case never really had any like audio. I know that there were video, but it was very rare to find. That case was something that you always saw pictures of in, black and white, printed in newspaper. Very, it's not very clear to see, or your book. And your book sealed it for me. It was like, oh, okay. And then finding how you did your research. But recently, MGM Plus comes out with the new Ed Gein. What is it called? The Lost Tapes of Ed Gein?
Yeah, something like Psycho: The Lost Tapes of Ed Gein.
Yeah. What was the new evidence of Ed Gein that came to light?
A tape, a cassette tape, I think it was cassette. It might have been reel-to-reel, actually, surfaced, which contains an interview with Gein that nobody knew existed before, in which he confesses to these crimes.
Was this the initial after he got caught?
Yeah, this was right after he was taken into custody. The content of it isn't kind of radically different from the confession he made when he was brought to which my mind were going. He was taken. It wasn't. I'm trying to remember.
It's funny. I've got the books all around us.
Yeah. Well, anyway, he was taken to be interviewed, by serious interrogators. And the transcript of that interview exists. So we know exactly what he said. And what he said in these tapes isn't, there aren't any sort of, eye-opening revelations in terms of what he did and so on and so forth. The thing to me that was most revelatory about them was hearing his voice, because how like, when you talk to somebody on the phone that you don't know, you always imagine how they look. Well, sort of the reverse. I knew how Eddie Gein looked. I knew how people saw him. and I always imagined he sounded a certain way.
What did you think he sounded
I
like?
kind of always imagine that his voice, and again, this might, this might seem very sexist of me, but I always imagine his voice as being more effeminate, really, because everything I'd read about him suggested that, there were certain effeminate mannerisms he had. And he didn't sound, he just sounded like a regular guy, and he sounded, very coherent and so on and so forth. So, and just hearing his voice, speaking of objects connected with crimes, when I write my books, I sometimes like to have some object that is connected to the crime on my desk. For example, I wrote a book called Maniac about a guy who blew up a public school in Michigan in 1927. It still remains the worst school massacre in U.S. history. His name was Andrew Kehoe, and what he used to blow up the school was what was called pyritol. Pyritol was an inexpensive, sort of low-grade dynamite that the government made out of surplus gunpowder after World War I and sold to farmers so that they could clear boulders and tree stumps from their land. And Kehoe acquired several boxes full of pyritol and managed to rig them up in the basement of the school and then detonate them. He killed like 37 children and some teachers. Anyway, I got on eBay, I guess, part of a pyritol box. For me, it just makes the historical events that I'm writing about more real, more tangible. So there's a sense in which hearing Ed Gein's voice, brought his humanity, it just made his humanity that much more real. Because again, Gein has become such a mythic figure that it's hard to think of him as just like an actual flesh and blood living human being, who resided on a farm in Wisconsin in the 1940s and 50s.
But did hearing his voice change anything on his psychological profile for you? Like, did it change how you perceived him?
Well, I had already come to think of Gein as kind of smarter than a lot of his townspeople thought of him. They kind of always described him as very simple-minded and not exactly the town idiot, but, something along those lines. And I'd had a discussion years ago with somebody who was very obsessed with the Gein case and had interviewed Gein extensively when he was institutionalized, and has in his possession apparently a lot of tapes of Ed Gein. And this person told...
Now, tapes like videotape or audio?
Just audio tapes.
Okay.
And this person told me, that Ed had been reading Freud while he was in this mental institution. And Gein was very dismissive of all that Freudian stuff. Of course, at the time of the Gein crimes, Freud was in his, Freudian theory was in its heyday, and everybody was analyzing Gein, according to the Oedipal complex and so on and so forth. Gein was very dismissive of all that. But the point being, I already knew that Gein was much smarter than, he had been described by a lot of people who had known him. So in that sense, I mean, hearing him speak and sounding as kind of rational as he sounds did not come as a great surprise to me.
Yeah. He sounded like an embarrassed kid to me, which came across in the transcription of his interviews before, but just, when they were asking him certain questions, do you remember doing this or do you remember doing that? And how he would conveniently forget. But then certain things he would remember. And like I said, he just sounded like an embarrassed child. Originally, I thought he was actually insane. Like maybe he shouldn't have gotten the death penalty. Maybe he should have been sent to an insane asylum. But after hearing the tapes, I'm like, I don't know. Like, and also when you think about it, there was something that he said, like on one hand, he said that he went into a daze, but on the other hand, he said he was really interested in human anatomy. Yeah. Which sounds pretty predetermined.
Yeah. He's very evasive in a lot of the, confession. And of course, the interrogators would ask a lot of leading questions. So did you cut out the vagina? Oh, I guess so. You could see where he might not. It's very, very, very typical, for a man who has created, or a woman who has committed these atrocious crimes, to not come right out. And
yeah.
I was just writing about some guy, I can't remember what particularly horrible crime I was writing about, but it was the same thing. I mean, they sort of caught him dead to rights, but when they were interrogating him, he was fumbling around and making all these excuses and so on and so forth. It took a while before he finally broke down, and confessed the truth, partly because, well, I mean, they're not psychotic for the most part. That is to say, they're not totally detached from reality. They're very well aware, that these acts they've committed, are unspeakably awful and shameful. So, they're not prone, to immediately fessing up to these things.
Yeah. With the tapes, it was the part where he was saying it was about the genitalia that he had cut off.
Yeah.
And he was the one who was giving them the story. He was like, when it decomposes, I tried to paint it silver.
Right.
And they were like, why'd you do that? And he was like, to preserve it, I guess. Yeah. And he goes, well, what did you do after that? And he's like, put it away.
Yeah.
Like a child who didn't just put it away.
Oh,
you know what I mean? Like a child who's lying about eating a cookie. It's like, it's okay. It didn't say. So it was just those things. Cause now when I read put it away, I'm like, oh, he put it away.
Yeah.
But when I hear him say it that way, I'm like,
yeah.
I think he knows he did a lot more than he's even telling us now.
Yeah. Hard to know.
It is hard to know. There is a theory that he's done a lot more, right? That we don't know about.
Well, there's a theory, he always denied. The thing about Gein, first of all, which I'm always insisting on when I speak about him, is that he really wasn't a serial killer in the way the term serial killer was originally, meant,
And a serial killer is meant, like what? Let's break it down for normal.
So the term serial murder, which was first coined back in the 1930s by a German detective who was on the trail of a horrendous sadistic killer named Peter Curtin, who was nicknamed the Vampire of Dusseldorf, referred to a type of killer that was then commonly called a lust murderer. So the lust murderer was an extreme sexual sadist who derived his perverse sexual pleasure from torturing and killing and mutilating helpless victims. And that's how the term serial killer, that's what it meant when it first entered common usage, which in America wasn't until like the 1980s. And it was used to describe people like Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Edmund Kemperer, again, these extreme sexual sadists who were driven by this profoundly perverse need to torture and mutilate victims in order to, get off on these acts. This is why, there's a famous cooling off period with serial murder, because it sort of parallels, it's a very, very depraved version of normal sexual functioning in that, let's say, the ordinary heterosexual male, or it could be the ordinary homosexual male for that matter, might fantasize about some, let's say, okay, I'm going to use an example of a heterosexual serial killer, fantasize about some woman or some type of woman, and then somehow manage to make love to her. And, the sexual drive will subside for a while, and then he'll need it to do it again or want to do it again, and so on and so forth. The pattern of classic serial murder is the same. You have these guys like Gacy or Dahmer or whoever, who have this sexual urge to torture and kill somebody, and they will claim a victim, and then the urge will subside for a while, and then it will build up again, and then they'll claim, get another victim and torture and murder them, and so on and so forth. So my point being, that was originally how the term serial killer was used, to describe Edmund Kemper, some guy who would pick up hitchhikers and murder them and dismember them and behead them and, have oral sex with their decapitated heads and so on and so forth. In other words, it was pretty much synonymous with what used to be called lust murder. The term has sort of been expanded now, but, Ed Gein, that wasn't what drove Ed Gein. Ed Gein wasn't a sexual sadist. The two women that we know he killed, and I believe they probably were his only two victims, he executed very swiftly. He just basically wanted their bodies as dead bodies as raw material. So what Gein was, a necrophile, essentially. He was someone in love with the dead. He would go to the cemetery and dig up these corpses of these women who remind of his mother and bring them home and do what he did with them. So I don't think of Gein as a serial killer. Again, I think of him as a necrophile.
Do you think he'll ever exhume more bodies or no?
No, I'm sure not.
I wonder why they didn't do it all to begin with. I mean, I would have just been, we're talking about the morbidly curious. They did the first one, they opened it up. There was just a hatchet inside, right? Yeah.
But before you get into that, I just want to go back a little, in terms of, what Gein may or may not have confessed to. He always said he never had sex with the corpses because he was revolted by the smell. So that's something we'll never know, whether or not he did in fact have sex with the corpses or attempt to have sex with the corpses. That was a line, that in a way he, said he wouldn't cross.
Yeah.
But we don't know that.
There was the line you wouldn't cross. You made one of the funniest lines ever in your book, and it was when he had complained about the apple pie.
Oh, yeah.
And you were like, the little man who ate salted vaginas was complaining about the dryness of the cheese.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the other line that a psychiatrist I interviewed said about him, was that he was a sexually normal man. Back then, what that meant was he wasn't homosexual. So the fact that he was digging up corpses and having sex with them, didn't sort of count. But anyway, but in answer to your question, part of it was, the sensitivities of the townspeople. Plainfield was a very small, close-knit town. The authorities did not necessarily, want the people they knew, these family members, that their the bodies of their loved ones had been horribly violated.
So there's still limbless, vaginaless corpses at Plainfield Cemetery.
Well, who knows? I mean, they're probably at this point in such an advanced state of decomposition.
Just bones now.
Yeah, there could be.
Yeah, that was one of the mind-blowing things thinking about it to me, was that they didn't exhume all the bodies to confirm it. But it's like, at that point, why would he be lying?
Yeah, I mean, they had enough confirmation.
Him not digging up his mom or digging up his mom, we don't know, is peculiar to me, because Yeah, I mean, and I would think that Augusta, out of everybody, would be the first person they would exhume.
Well, I mean, from what I understand, she was the first person he attempted to exhume. But as I think I describe in my book, and as was explained to me, the soil in that part of Wisconsin, very, very sandy. So sometimes the graves, in order to keep everything from collapsing immediately, would be lined with these concrete sort of vaults, and they would put the coffin in there. Sometimes people would do that in the past so that their graves wouldn't be violated. I mean, supposedly H.H. Holmes, the notorious Chicago serial killer from the 1890s, was very afraid some souvenir hunter would dig up his own body and insisted on being buried in a concrete vault. But my understanding is that Augusta, that he couldn't get access to Augusta's coffin.
Yeah. I remember in the MGM Plus documentary that they said they went to this city of Plainfield and asked if they could exhume the bodies, but they denied it.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that all this time has passed and people are still as interested in it as they were when it happened.
Well, people are more interested in it than when it happened. When I was, wrote Deviant, I mean, I hadn't heard of Ed Gein. I only became aware of him because I was writing a book about movie special effects. And when I was writing about Psycho and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which were the two films at that point, possibly even now, I regarded as the greatest horror movies ever made, that they were both based on the same guy. And that was the first I had ever heard of Ed Gein. Now again, as the existence of this new documentary shows, there's more fascination with him than ever.
Yeah.
But I perhaps immodestly think, that it was partly my book that kind of revived some interest in him.
Well, I think when people think Ed Gein, and when we're looking for credible sources to read, I mean, it's like yours is the end all be all. I mean, that is the Ed Gein.
Yeah.
I don't even know if there are any other Ed Gein books. If there are,
there was another one that came out not too long after my book, but I was not very impressed with it.
One of the most interesting things I learned in Deviant was that Robert Bloch only lived 30 miles from where it happened.
Yeah. Well, his wife, I corresponded with Bloch when I was writing Deviant. I still have some letters he sent me. He actually led me to my second true crime book because at one point I asked him why did he think people were so fascinated by Gein, and he said because they've forgotten about Albert Fish.
That's such a hard line. That is a really that's a good response.
Yeah. So that led me to research, my follow-up book. But as I remember, again, my memory is rapidly failing me. But Bloch's wife was ill. I think she had tuberculosis of the bones or some strange thing. And they went back to live with her family in Wisconsin and were there when the Gein story broke. And of course, it was all over the front pages, big headlines. And that, that was the inspiration for Psycho. And if you read the novel Psycho, when Norman Bates is arrested, he talks about how people compare him to Ed Gein. So that was how Bloch got the idea. Bloch got a little annoyed at me because in my book Deviant, I say something to the effect that Alfred Hitchcock transformed what was basically, I forget the exact words I use, but, like a cheap pulp thriller or something like that, into this great masterpiece.
Yeah.
And then Robert Bloch, after my book came out, edited a book of stories about psychopathic murderers, and in his introduction, he talks about my book as a cheap pulp thriller. So,
jeez,
yeah.
Hey, well, at least he inspired it was Deranged with Albert Fish.
Yeah.
My question is, how come more people don't know about Albert Fish? Like, why hasn't he blown into the stratosphere of serial killers like someone like Gein or Charles Manson?
I just think Fish's story is too appallingly horrible, for, even, for all but the most diehard true crime fanatic to deal with. I can't imagine making a movie that does justice to the horror of Fish's crimes.
I don't think you could.
Yeah.
With what he's done, you couldn't.
Yeah. No, so, that was the book that was most difficult for me to write, actually, because I have two daughters who are, young, roughly the age of, Fish's main victim, Grace Budd. And, just reading his own detailed descriptions.
And this happened in New York in the 40s, right?
The 1930s. But I mean,
30s.
he was arrested and executed in the 1930s.
Wow.
But I mean, he had been preying on children, for like 40 years before that. He was going all over the country preying on children. And he would torture them in most horrendous ways.
Yeah.
So
with Albert Fish, I bought Deranged, but I never ended up finishing it. Because in prep for the show, I was like, I want to read Deviant again. I just, Ed Gein interests me so much. And with Albert Fish, before I had found your book, I had struggled with even believing that the story was real because it was so over the top.
Yeah.
So I guess in Spark Notes, for maybe the 4 people who don't know who Albert Fish is, what would be a good summary to give that man?
Well, so in a few words, Fish was a cannibal pedophile. Now, Fish was kind of unique in the history of psychopathology because he practiced, as one of the psychiatrists who ultimately examined him wrote, he practiced every known, what used to be, I guess they're now called paraphilias. They used to be called sexual perversions, known in the medical textbooks, and some that people had never heard of. He was just this extreme sadist and this extreme masochist who derived his deepest pleasure from torturing young children, mostly boys, although the final victim that he killed and was finally captured for having murdered was a young girl. But I mean, he would do things like, he would abduct a young boy, take him to some remote location, rape him and then castrate him and then leave him there to bleed to death. He just committed the most atrocious sexual mutilations on these young, helpless victims. But he also did things to himself that nobody could believe. I mean, one of his forms of pleasure was to take a rose, a long stem rose with the thorns still on the stem and insert them into his urethra and then, sort of parade around the mirror. And then he would yank the stem out and then eat the flower, something he'd like to do. When he was arrested, finally, his jailers noticed that he was very uncomfortable sitting on the cot in his cell. And he explained to them that it was because he had all these needles floating around his bladder area. And nobody believed him. He said he one form of pleasure that he had was inserting sewing needles of different sizes up into his perineum so far that they would stay in his body. So they took him to the infirmary and x-rayed him, and sure enough, it's a very infamous x-ray. There's an x-ray showing his pelvic region with all these needles floating around it. So, yeah, I mean, Fish was really a unique case in terms of, again, both in terms of all the perversions that he practiced over the course of decades until he was finally captured. I mean, he was 65 years old when they finally executed him. So,
yeah. I feel like it's a subconscious habit to be like, oh, that was in the past. There's nobody like that around today, which makes me curious. Like, how many Albert Fishes are there running around, or Ed Geins out there running around that we just don't know about yet? Because these guys got away with it. How long did Albert Fish get away with this for?
Well, his masochistic activities started when he was very young. I mean, as I said, he wasn't really caught till he was in his 60s. And again, the one atrocity that he had not committed was cannibalism. So he got it into his head that he was going to abduct and cannibalize a victim. And he was incredibly devious. He originally thought he wanted to cannibalize a young boy. So he put an ad in New York City newspapers claiming that he was a wealthy strawberry farmer with a farm out on Long Island, and he was looking to hire a young man to work the farm during the summer. And the ad was answered by a young man named William Budd, who lived in Manhattan. And Gein came to the Budd house with a plan to hire William Budd, who was a teenager, and lure him out to Long Island and again torture him and kill him and eat parts of his body. But when he was visiting the Budd house, William's younger sister, Grace, who was, I think, 9 years old at the time, came in, and Fish was immediately taken by her, and he decided he would kill and eat her. So he managed to lure her with her parents' permission. He said he was going to a niece's birthday party, and he was sure Grace would really enjoy it. Fish looked like this harmless old grandfather, and he'd ingratiated himself with the Budds. And of course, the Budds were very, very poor, and they didn't want to offend what they believed was going to be their son's summer employer. So they let Grace go with Fish, and Fish took her up to an abandoned house up in Westchester, north of the city. And he strangled her and cut off, I think, about 9 pounds of her flesh, brought it back to his boarding house, and spent the next week, he made it into a stew, and spent the next week eating it. And then he totally got away with the crime for the next 4 years or more. He was a habitual writer of obscene letters to people, and he wrote a letter to Grace Budd's mother describing exactly what he had done to her daughter. And it was through the envelope that letter came in that this one detective, William King, who had the abduction of Grace Budd had become a personal obsession, was managed to track down Fish.
Interesting. So what, the address on the envelope, or how did you trace that?
I mean, as I remember the story, it's been many years since I wrote the book, Fish had been staying in some kind of boarding house, and there was some stationery in his room that had been left by a previous tenant. And the stationery was embossed with the insignia of this chauffeurs association that the tenant had belonged to. And Fish took some of the stationery, and he scratched out the insignia, but he didn't do a very good job of it, and sent the letter to Grace Budd's mother in that envelope. And King, using old-fashioned seat-of-the-pants detective work, managed to trace, the envelope to the association, to the membership. He found out who, the association member, the chauffeur, who had taken some of the stationery, and that chauffeur had been living for a while in this boarding house, and they discovered that the person who lived in the boarding house afterwards was this guy Albert Fish, who was going by a different name, and he caught him. So, he'd been all over the country. Again, he was in his 60s. For the time he was 20, he was going around the country. He would often pretend to be a house painter, and he would wear coveralls. He was naked under the coveralls, and he'd be painting a house or something, or an apartment building, and he would manage to lure a child into the basement or whatever, and perpetrate these horrors on them. He would, strip off his coveralls, so he didn't get blood all over his clothes. And then he would just disappear. He did that for decades.
Yeah.
Also, like Jeffrey Dahmer, he often preyed on minorities. In Fish's case, he would go into the black neighborhoods, and prey on African-American children, believing correctly, that the police, and the public weren't particularly interested, in what happens to black people.
Yeah.
That still is the case, where, if a young white girl, white child, is abducted and murdered, it generates much more publicity than if it happens to an African-American kid.
Did he have, like his signature thing? Like, did he kill these people in any particular way, or was it always just random?
Well, after torturing them sufficiently, I think he would usually strangle them, though again, sometimes he would, with the boys, as I said, castrate them and leave them to bleed to death.
You were in contact with his lawyer, correct?
Yes. Yeah, that was amazing.
And how old was he when you got in contact with him?
What happened was, I knew the name of the lawyer who had represented Fish at his trial. And I knew Fish was tried in, he committed this murder in Westchester County, north of New York. And I was living in Westchester at the time. And I knew the name of his lawyer, from all the newspaper articles and so on. And I knew the lawyer had lived in a town just a little north of mine, Poughkeepsie. And so I got the Poughkeepsie phone book and I looked up, and sure enough, there was a lawyer listed of that name. And I assumed it must be the guy's son because, this was like the 1980s, and the Fish trial had happened in the 1930s. So I called, turned out it was the guy who was 90 years old, in his 90s, but still, had all his mental faculties intact. In fact, came to the office every day. So, I arranged to come meet him at his office and spoke to him. And he had the only extant transcript of the Fish trial, which had appended to it all this incredible material, like copies of every obscene letter that Fish had written, all this psychiatric testimony. And I knew I needed this thing if I was going to write my book. And I asked him if I could take it to the local Xerox place and make a copy, and he refused to let it out of his hands. I had parked right outside his office, and you could see my car. I said, "Here are the keys to my car. If I don't come back with this from the Xerox place, you could have my car." He said, No. Finally, I was actually thinking, maybe I could murder him and nobody would. But finally he agreed. He had a big estate. And he said he agreed if I let his estate manager accompany me to the Xerox place, and I would pay the estate manager for his time and stand there while I Xeroxed the transcript, which I did. And I obviously did a lot more research. But
being able to talk to someone who practiced law that long ago is interesting in and of itself. What did he have to say personally about the case?
I don't remember.
Or was he closed? Did he just give you the paperwork and he was like, get away?
Well, pretty much. I mean, he didn't, as I said, just give it to me. Took a lot of persuading on my part and begging and entreating.
I'm glad you didn't kill him.
I'm glad to, in retrospect.
Yeah.
But the thought did cross my mind.
Would have been a good book.
Nobody around.
Yeah.
True crime author commits murder so he can get the research material for his true crime book.
Yeah.
But I just remember as being kind of a cranky old guy. But still, I mean, again, coming close to that history that I was writing about.
Now, living this close to where it happened, have you ever visited any of the...
I did. Gein Fish murdered Grace Budd in a house that was known as locally as Wisteria Cottage, because there was a lot of wisteria growing on in a town very close to where I was living. Part of my research, the town is called Greenberg, I think. I drove there, and I knew the road that the house was located on, from newspaper reports. So I was driving on, I drove there, and I was driving up this road, a little hilly. Couldn't find this place, and a teenager or young woman in her 20s, came driving down the other direction. And she kind of stopped because she could tell I didn't know where I was going, and rolled down the window and asked, if I needed directions. And I said, yeah, I'm looking for a place that used to be called Wisteria Cottage. And she said, oh, it's right over there. So I drove in, parked. I always imagined it as a cottage. It was actually, fairly decent sized house, and knocked on the door. The residents answered. Very nice. I said, look, I'm researching this book. I don't know if you know, but there was this very gruesome, sensational murder that happened here, like in the 1930s. And they said, oh, we'd always heard something had happened here, but, we don't know the details.
And they live inside of that place?
Yeah.
Wow.
But, it was nice, obviously, since in the half century from the time the murder happened till the time they bought the house, it had undergone a lot of remodeling and stuff. Anyway, I told them the whole story. They were
gave them some nice dreams.
Yeah. And, Fish had disposed of, the dismembered parts of Grace Budd's body, in the woods behind their house. So, yeah, they let me tour the whole place. And it was actually, again, made a big difference in terms of my writing about it, just because it just made it so much more real, to actually be there, and see where this crime had happened. Yeah, so yes.
Now, there's got to be some sort of I don't know. I read most of the accounts of what happened, and how when I believe it was in your book, and she walks upstairs, he's naked at the end of the hall, she starts crying.
Well, she screams, I'm going to tell Mama.
Yeah. Oh, man, that part hit me in the heart, man, because that was just nothing needed to happen. All she needed to see was a naked old man to know what was up. She didn't need to say anything. It was like, oh, Jesus.
Yeah.
And just such a terrible fucking thing that happened.
Yeah.
But, we're writing about it. We're talking about it. We record podcasts for people that are interested in it.
Well, let me just interject here. I think that's one of the functions that podcasts and books and so on and so forth serve psychologically. These crimes are so unimaginable. You don't psychologically know what to do with them. So turning them into stories, gives you, in a way, some sense of control over it. We tell stories, this has become a cliche, but man is a storytelling creature. I'm using man, obviously in an old-fashioned way, gender-insensitive way.
I always think mankind.
Yeah. Well, human beings. Humanity. It's a storytelling species. We make sense of our lives by telling stories. The stories we tell about our lives don't necessarily conform to the stories our husbands and wives might tell about our lives. But the point is, turning something into a story gives you a sense of control over these terrible anxieties and fears and sometimes forbidden fantasies, that these things generate. So, that's very important. I think that true crime narratives, serve a very important social and psychological function.
Mm-hmm. They almost act as a
which is
cautionary
complex.
tale.
Well, it's not a cautionary tale. First of all, it allows you to safely ventilate, your own dark side, but at the same time, it also somehow gives you some sense, a handle on these chaotic, inchoate fears and anxieties that hearing, learning about some horror stirs up, And we need those stories from a very young age. As I'm sure you know, Grimm's fairy tales, many of them are incredibly horrific, but children somehow need to hear them, because it gives them a way of controlling their own fears and anxieties. And in a way, when I started writing Deviant, for example, I sort of thought of it in terms of a real-life fairy tale. It's like when you're a kid, I don't know if you had this experience, but many, many people do. Kids often tell stories about some scary person who lives in some weird house. It's like the Boo Radley thing in To Kill a Mockingbird. When I was growing up in the Bronx, me and my friends, they always told stories about some scary old witch-like lady, who lived in apartment 6C. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Kids do that. And, it's like Hansel and Gretel, right? There's some remote, out-of-the-way place where there's a really scary ogress or whatever. The Gein story was true. The Gein case was true, right? It was this fairy tale come true. And I thought of it as a sort of fairy tale. So point being, again, casting these things into these narratives, is a way of helping us somehow make some kind of sense of them.
Did you have a boogeyman of your generation?
Oh, yeah. Well, I was terrified of a lot of things. In Life magazine, I actually got a few years ago, found and got a copy of this. There was an article about a Wild West festival that was held every year. I can't remember where, Kansas or Nebraska or Oklahoma. And as part of it, they reenacted Indian tortures. And there was a full color image of a guy, incredibly realistic, being skinned alive by his Native American captors. In Life magazine, Life magazine would, run horrific, pictures sometimes. But that one, really, traumatized me. But, you can never tell what's going to traumatize. I was traumatized when I saw, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Disney's, when the queen turns into the witch.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of early Disney movies had horrific, traumatic things.
Yeah.
But yeah, when I grew up, and again, this, in a way, my becoming a true crime writer is rooted in my lifelong fascination with horror and monster, movies and stories. When I grew up in the 50s, American pop culture was just steeped in all this horror stuff. It was the time when on TV, the classic Universal horror movies, Dracula, Frankenstein, The Wolfman, etc., were first being shown on TV. I would go to kiddie matinees every Saturday, and see all these, horror monster movies and horror movies. When the Hammer movies came out, the first Frankenstein movie, I remember being traumatized by the trailer, for the first Hammer Frankenstein movie, because the trailer showed like an eyeball, in a vial or something. Mm-hmm. There was Forrest Ackerman's famous Monsters of Filmland, which I read all the time. There were these Friday night creature feature shows. So, yeah, I've always been steeped in that. I'm the same age as Steven Spielberg and Stephen King. If you read Stephen King's It, the original novel, it's all filled with, the same kinds of monster stuff that he and I grew up in, baby boomers grew up with. So,
yeah, I asked that because I was at a movie theater a couple of months ago, and a guy came in with a backpack on, and my heart started racing. And I started thinking to myself, like, would people even question that 50 years ago?
Oh, no. Yeah, you wouldn't question that. I mean, there weren't, mass shootings in movie theaters, if that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it was there was a lot.
Would the thought of somebody even having a gun in there be a thought?
But that's a very recent phenomenon.
Yeah.
In other words, our obsession with mass murder. That's something I've spoken about before. One of the things that I've become aware of in my researches into historical true crime is that, there are certain signature crimes that define a certain era. I first became aware of it when I was doing a book about a very notorious poison murder that happened at the turn of the 20th century, like 1899, 1900s. There were a number of them, very infamous poison murders. Back then, the public was kind of obsessed with the poison murderer. And again, it wasn't like there were really that many of them, but there were a number of sensational ones. And I think the reason that the public was so obsessed with the notion of poison murder was because they were living at a time when they literally didn't know if the food or the medications or that they put in their mouths was going to kill them. There was no FDA. There's no government regulation. You look at some of the medications that you could buy over the counter, and the ingredients were things like arsenic. And again, as we know, there was no at that time, during the progressive era, things changed, but there was no oversight, in terms of, canned food. I mean, a lot of the canned food, they used to call it swill milk. Mothers would buy milk at the grocery store, which would poison their children. And when they send canned beef over with the American soldiers, who were fighting the Spanish-American War, when they opened up, they were filled with botulism. So people were very obsessed with poison. The 1930s, after the Lindbergh kidnapping, there was this whole moral panic about, children being kidnapped by sexual psychopaths. The serial killer thing, to some extent, I think was a reflection, of the sexual freedom of the 1970s, and after that, where it's like, the reigning ethos was, if it feels good, do it.
What was the intermediary? What was the 40s all the way up to the 70s?
Well, the 40s. Well, in the 50s, again, I think the 40s. Everybody was obsessed with World War II. In the 50s and into the 60s, it became juvenile delinquency. That became the great scourge. There were public polls that show that, there was more public worry over juvenile delinquency than there was over open-air nuclear testing. The juvenile delinquent became the boogeyman. The switchblade-wielding juvenile delinquent became the boogeyman of the moment. I grew up during that time. I grew up in the Bronx, in a safe neighborhood, but it was abutted by other neighborhoods, where there was, switchblade-wielding street gangs and stuff.
Yeah.
But the serial killer thing is, faded. The Gilgo Beach guy, who very close to where I now own a house, that became the first, kind of widely publicized serial killer case in a long time. But, it's been supplanted now by the mass murderer. The mass murderer, has become, the great, terror of the moment.
I wonder if there's any psychological difference between mass murderers and serial killers. Like when you sit them down and question them together. I know one is more sexual based, and
but it's totally different psychology.
Interesting. So you don't think same upbringing, same kind of abusive relationships, or they have different variables that set it off?
Well, again, serial murder is a sex crime. Serial murderers don't want to be caught. They don't want to be stopped because they enjoy what they're doing. it's a it's sadistic sex crime. That's what serial murder is. Again, if you look at the classic serial murders, that's what they were. They were extreme sexual sadists. Gacy luring teenage boys to his house and torturing them. Or you're talking about Dean Corll. The things that some of these people did, are so unspeakable, one doesn't even want to think about them. But that's how they got their sexual pleasure. Serial killers, typically would have an orgasm, at the moment they were killing. Mass murder tends to be a complete different kind of act. Basically, for the most part, not always, it's the act of a man. There have been a few female mass murders, but not many, who somehow his life has become unraveled, who's reached the end of the road, who blames the world or sometimes specific people, for the failure his life has become, who sees no life for himself and decides to commit suicide and go out with a bang. It's basically a suicidal act. They're going to go out and take as many people with them as they can. They're going to destroy their world and as much of the world as they can. Either, again, many mass murders end with the killer putting a bullet in his own head or, suicide by cop and so on and so forth. But it's a completely different act. And the psychology is completely different.
Yeah. But it goes back a long time, too. I mean, I think the first one, circling back to Murderabilia, you have in there one of the guns of the first, was it one of the guns of the first school shooting?
Oh, this first school shooting? No, I have, there was a guy named Howard Unruh who lived in New Jersey. He was a World War II veteran who went on this spree and shot a bunch of his neighbors, and he's considered the first modern mass murder.
Oh, at the barber shop and at the, okay, sorry, go on.
Yeah. But I mean, look, I mean, human beings have always been mass murdering other human beings. I don't know if you just saw the recent movie, The Northman, about the Vikings. I mean, you look through human history and there's nothing new about massacres, and mass murders. I mean, in the past, if you were a homicidal psychopath, you could join the army and kill and maim and mutilate all the people you want and get a medal for it. Even, in the history of our own country, if you're a homicidal psychopath, you can join the cavalry and, butcher a lot of Native Americans and, get promoted. So, there's nothing new about that. Obviously what's new is the availability, of powerful semi-automatic weaponry. I mean, there are always going to be mass murderers. I come across cases when I do my research of mass murderers, again, back in the 1800s, some guy goes crazy and maybe shoots down a few of his neighbors with a shotgun, but now, you have these highly unstable, a lot of politicians say, well, it's not a gun issue, it's a mental health issue. And yeah, it is a mental health issue. I mean, these guys are obviously unhinged in some way. But if you put, an AR-15 in their hands or whatever, you're gonna have a much more tragic result, than if they don't have access to that kind of weapon.
Right. I think a part that plays into that too is how media glamorizes the shooter or even the serial killer too. They really did it with Manson. Manson was pretty much made a celebrity. But sometimes I'll watch the news when they're putting up these counters of how many people died at these mass shootings, and I'm like, there's a psycho out there who's watching this, thinking I could beat all of that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, again, there have always been news media reports. I mean, I remember, although I can't actually remember at the moment, there were a number of serial killers who wanted to outdo Jack the Ripper, So, yeah, I mean, to the extent that some of these killers are motivated by the publicity they know. It's like this famous New York journalist, Jimmy Breslin. said of Son of Sam. He was a nobody who became somebody by killing people. So there's no question. I think in the case of mass murders, I don't think it's a case of serial murders, because I don't think serial murders, again, they don't want to be caught because they want to keep on, having their horrible sex mutilation murder.
Well, when you look at BTK, I mean, it almost kind of seems like he wanted to get caught.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, he seemed to miss the attention he was getting. And there have certainly been serial killers who have, sought some publicity by taunting the police and so. But for the most part, they want to continue perpetrating their atrocities.
Well, it's probably one of their, that's getting so close to getting caught is probably something that gets them off as well.
I don't think it's so much getting close to getting caught. I think it's a kind of megalomania. That's to say, I think it makes them feel powerful, knowing that the police can't catch them. Because I think, I feel one of the things that many serial killers share in their background is this history of childhood humiliation. They're often made to feel like they're nothing, they're worthless. And they grow up on some level, feeling I'm going to prove I'm powerful. And, as has been said many times, I mean, the ultimate form of power is the power of life and death over another person. So, I think it's part of, I think it's rooted in that, this ultimate feeling of worthlessness, of nothingness, of inferiority. And they're going to prove they're, in a way, I hope this won't be misunderstood, but they lead the lives that are kind of like Batman. In other words, they lead these double lives. They have this public persona and then this sinister secret life, and it makes them feel like a superhero in some way, and that the police can't catch them and they can just write taunting letters about how powerless the police are. You're never going to get me. Good luck with that. Like the Zodiac killer and so on. So that's one phenomenon. In the case of mass murder, I mean, I think, again, this is a guy whose life has gone to shit. He's gotten divorced. He's lost his job, whatever. He has nothing to live for, but he's going to prove in the end, that he was at least successful at something, which is killing somebody, and getting into the news. So,
yeah, that spectrum is fascinating. How some people, my ultimate form of power, or in my head at least, is like being able to just freedom, doing what I want. Mm-hmm. And when I think of doing what I want, it's not to other people. It's like money, being able to travel somewhere. Mm-hmm. To think that there is a spectrum of people, and on the other extreme side of that, people find power in being able to determine whether someone's still breathing or not is mind-blowingly uncomfortable. Especially when you get into somebody like BTK, who wasn't caught that long ago. Yeah. I mean, it was about 20 years ago, so I guess it was pretty long ago. But I mean, relatively speaking, that's a pretty recent aged serial killer compared to, Richard Ramirez or Bundy. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think Dahmer actually happened, in the 80s?
Yeah.
Yeah, so fairly recent, which is why it's so fascinating to me. I've always wondered how you choose who you want to write about, because I feel like BTK is such a prime candidate with how open he was.
Well, first of all, I think of myself as a true crime historian, and, at least in terms of, book length projects, I'm not interested in writing about contemporary people or people who are still alive. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is, it needs to have some kind of compelling story for me, because I'm devoting, a chunk of my life to doing it. And I need something that I feel can be turned into a compelling narrative, like the Gilgo Beach murder. Although a friend of mine, Bob Kolker, has written a wonderful book called The Lost Girls about the Gilgo Beach case, which largely focuses on the victims. But to me, the Gilgo Beach murderer is not particularly interesting. He seems sort of like a garden variety serial killer. There've been like Jack the Ripper. They used to call them harlot killers. Men filled with hatred of women who will, murder sex workers. So I look for cases, that have some very interesting, to me, narrative component that I feel I can bring to life and make a compelling book out of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But so what are, I don't want to ask what you're working on, but what are, I think, killers that you've thought of in the past that you've wanted to write about that are more well-known? Like, have you ever thought about doing a Manson book or something just out of the ordinary?
There's no point. I mean, I'm doing a book now called 50 States of Murder, which has short entries on the most infamous murders in every state, but I'm not writing about Manson in California or Gacy in Illinois, because those have been done to death. Everybody knows them. I have nothing more interesting to say about them. I mean, they are historical figures, so they're included in Murderabilia. But in the new book, I'm concentrating on murders that are very sensational and have kind of entered into the criminal lore of the state, but that most people don't know about at all, and that are new to me. There is a book that I do want to write and that my wife is urging me to write, although I might not get to it for another couple of years because I'm about to launch into another book about a 19th century serial killer. But I don't want to say too much about it.
Yeah, don't. Yeah. Leave it for a surprise.
Yeah.
No, I only wonder just because it's like, I could see why you wouldn't want to do that. I'm not going to write a book about Gacy just because there's a billion documentaries on it already. Yeah. But I was curious if there was any one of those, like, because there clearly is a Mount Rushmore of serial killers.
Yeah.
Like when you were talking about how a serial killer from the 19th century, I was like trying to think, I'm like, who could it possibly be? Because you've really just got that Mount Rushmore of like the Gacy, the Bundy, the Manson, Richard Ramirez. And I don't know why I am so captivated by late 60s to, I guess late 80s serial killers. Their personalities, and the way they spoke, listening to, and they were just so heavily documented too. I mean, everything was recorded. We have hours upon hours of footage of John Wayne Gacy talking. Yeah. And same thing with Dahmer.
Yeah.
I wonder what's so captivating about that one part. For someone like myself who wasn't born in the 60s or 70s, who associates that kind of lifestyle with it.
Mm-hmm. Well, we are from a childhood on fascinated by monsters. Now, why we're fascinated by monsters is a complex question that, different psychiatrists and so on have different theories about. When I wrote Deviant, the term serial killer does not appear in either Deviant or Deranged, because again, it hadn't really entered the language yet. But I thought I was, again, immodestly inventing a new genre. I thought I was writing something called true horror. Because at some point, as you grow older, you stop really believing that there's a Wolfman or a Frankenstein monster or a werewolf or a Dracula. But for whatever reason, our imaginations require stories about monsters. So what I was looking for initially were real stories about real life monsters. Not so much stories about real life terrible murderers or whatever. So the people you mentioned, for whatever complex reason, there was that moment in our culture, that produced a number of these true life monsters, and these people, when fish was caught, newspapers called them, the werewolf of Wisteria. When Gein was caught, he was called the Plainfield Ghoul. H.H. Holmes was called, they called his place Bluebeard's Castle. These figures, seem like childhood nightmare terrors come to flesh and blood life. And, we do become fascinated by them, again, in the way that children need. My kids, when they were little, and you'd read to them at night, they just wanted to hear the same fairy tale over and over again. And often it was Hansel and Gretel. There's, the need for those kinds of horrific fairy tales, has been analyzed, by a number of psychiatrists, from different perspectives, Freudian, Jungian, whatever. And again, complex issue. Let's just say that human beings need stories about monsters. And when you get older and stop believing in the fairy tale monsters, that need is fulfilled by reading and hearing stories about these real life monsters.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. With somebody like H.H. Holmes being in, what was the year he was caught? Or was he ever caught?
Oh, yeah. He was caught. He was executed. I've written up.
Late 1800s?
Yeah.
Man, it's like to go that far back and get record from that.
Well, 1890s. It wasn't like the Middle Ages.
But still, like when you hear 1890s, you think like, I was born in 1993.
Yeah. See, I was born in 1948. So,
that was still a while. That was a half a century from you.
Yeah, but when, as I am, you're 75 years old, 50 years ago doesn't seem like that long ago.
Yeah, that's true.
But yes, but the point is, in the 1890s, it was the heyday of what they called yellow journalism. I mean, they had amazing newspaper coverage of these crimes. Of course, a lot of it was very inaccurate. You have to be very, very careful. I mean, Holmes is a really interesting case because like 90%, of what people think they know about Holmes is total myth.
Yeah, and it's hard to tell because it's like, all the pictures are so ridiculously drawn of him too, and he kind of.
Well, it's not even that. It's just that. Again, the newspapers that were covering it, especially in Chicago, these Hearst newspapers, back then, these were the precursors of the tabloids. And, their reigning philosophy was like, never let the truth stand in the way of a good story. So, these papers would publish the most outlandish, sensationalistic things as fact. The whole notion that he had this murder hotel where he's killing hundreds of victims, it's like total bullshit. But it's what the papers reported at the time. So, but there were definite sources of information back in the 1890s.
I mean, we still get inaccuracies in our media today.
Oh, of course.
That's not necessarily a new thing either.
No, that's not.
Because if you were to look back in 50 years and look at some of the things going on today, I'm sure you'd find something where it's like, oh, they were completely out of their mind.
Well, that's going to happen, as you and I were discussing earlier, with AI.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. See,
Because,
I'm not afraid of AI necessarily.
I'm not afraid of AI, but you have to be really cautious.
So let me ask.
I'm doing a book, just to give you one example, 50 States of Murder. And at one point, after I started playing around with chat, I said, act as a true crime researcher, because it's good to say act or something, and you're researching very notorious murders that happened in Alabama in the 1940s. And chat goes, sure, here's one. Gives me this long description of what was called the Black Dahlia of the South. And, it gave this very detailed description of this murder of this young woman whose body was found bisected, the very infamous Black Dahlia in Los Angeles. And it just gave me like all this information, name, the dates, where her body was found, who found the body, what happened to the case. So I thought, wow, this is great. I never heard of this case, but it's exactly the kind of thing I'm looking for. This very, very notorious sensational crime that nobody's ever heard of. So I start researching it, newspapers, blah, blah. It never existed. I mean, Chat just made the whole thing up.
Yeah.
And then I said, Chat, you just made this whole thing up. And Chat said, yeah, I'm really, not allowed. It's like very sensitive information. I'm not really programmed. So when I'm asked about true crime, I create great oxymoron. I create fictional true crimes. So
I like how it told you the truth.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah. So in terms of trusting your sources of news, you got to be very careful.
Well, with AI, I feel like it's just language patterns.
Yeah.
So it's going to give you exactly what you tell it to. But I always figured that it was pulling from the internet. Like I thought it was scraping the knowledge base of the internet and giving you that.
I think there are other sources, though. I mean, that's, as you know, become a big thing. All these authors and stuff are suing these AI people, for pirating their works and so on.
Do you think they're, so it's grabbing sources and pay. Oh, okay. Yeah. I was going to ask if the story it wrote was like a Frankenstein of like several other stories it had put together.
It was just like its own original story. I mean, it's very impressive in a way. It was a great story. It just happened just to be, again, the phrase they use is AI hallucinations. It was a great story. It just wasn't true.
That's the next era of crime, AI crime.
Yeah.
We're going to see what happens.
Yeah.
Robots come to life, start hacking us up.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Yeah, well, whatever. I mean, I'm sure. I mean, I've long been convinced, that the human race is evolving. We're in sort of a transitionary period, and eventually will be some kind of organic, high-tech hybrid, which is, I mean, that's fine. I'm kind of sad. I'm not going to live to see that. But.
You might. Who knows?
Yeah, hopefully.
We've got Elon Musk here. I think he's actively working on that.
New hope for the dead.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, maybe a revival, or get a Neuralink chip installed, and maybe you'll live till 300.
That'd be excellent.
Yeah, that would be.
Yeah.
So, spending all of your time talking about this, writing about this, how does that make you feel? Does this? Yeah, I remember earlier you were saying that it makes you more comfortable with the concept of death. Whereas I feel like I'm on the opposite end of it. It almost makes me a little bit more aware of how fragile our life is.
Well, I wrote a book that you might be interested in. I'll send you a copy, called The Whole Death Catalog, which is all about death. When I turned, I think 50 or so, I did go through an intense death panic period. And I a little bit alleviated it by totally immersing myself in the world of death for a couple of years. And I wrote a book called The Whole Death Catalog. But, as I said, I have had a lifelong fascination with horror and the monstrous and the psychologically aberrant. One expression of that has been, my becoming a true crime writer, which was not, by the way, a career I had ever foreseen for myself. It just seemed to have happened. I don't know. Well, certainly not made me more comfortable with the idea of death. I'm still hoping science will cure death within the next few years.
Me too.
But, it's familiarized me with the outer limits of human behavior. I've said, trying to understand Jeffrey Dahmer is like trying to understand Mozart. There are these prodigies, of human behavior, sometime on the side of the angels, sometimes on the side of the devils, that represent the outermost boundaries, of what human beings are capable of and what the human mind is capable of. So, and being somebody who's always been interested in psychology, my PhD dissertation, I was very immersed in both Freud and Jung, used them in my I studied them intensively and, have written about them. So, yeah, I mean, it is partly that. Again, it's partly, as I said, I mean, my imagination in my youth was so shaped by horror stories that, I still, I've ended up just writing these horror stories.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've just noticed in the last 2 months reading books nonstop on true crime in prep for this show, how a little creak, because this hall, this wall, it's hollow behind it. There's nothing. I hear a little creak back there. I'm like, Jesus.
Let me say, by the way, that because I spend so much time researching and writing about this stuff, I do not watch true crime shows. Everybody always asks me if I watched Mindhunter, which I did not. I haven't even really watched much of the Ed Gein documentary that I'm featured in. I read a lot of true crime books to do my research, but I don't read true crime books for entertainment or pleasure. I hope it won't insult you to say that I don't listen. I didn't even know, this young woman I knew who does the framing for my pictures, when I first met her, and she saw my name, she said, "Oh, guys on Last Podcast on the Left are, often talking about you." And I'd never heard of the Last Podcast on the Left. And I still am, I've gotten to know the guys and I'm very, very fond of them. But, I don't listen to them. So
yeah, I'm not much of a true crime guy either. I'll watch like the Netflix documentaries and I'll pick up a book every now and again, but I don't like particularly go out of my way to seek it, which is weird because since I've started this show, and spending all my time researching and writing and, having this guest come on, and now I'm watching this set of movies and studying these sets of things. It is weird. Like watching horror movies is a little bit different now.
Yeah. Oh, totally.
Puts you in work mode in a way.
My taste for horror movies, again, this is a sign of my old age. I still watch horror movies. I've always had I've never liked, torture porn movies. I don't even like Saw. So I'll still watch horror movies, but my tolerance for horror movies of a certain level of intensity, has decreased. So,
I think there is something valuable. There was this quote I heard one time that horror is the blanket you throw over the invisible man, giving him shape.
Oh, well, that's a little bit, that's not too different from what I was saying about, how telling stories about these monsters, gives some kind of shape and control over them. So yeah, I like that quote.
Yeah. Well, Harold, you have been generous with your time today. You flew so far from New York to join us in the crypt.
With an injured finger.
Yeah. And hey, but we had a little bit of low luck together because the sign stopped working.
Well, it's working now. But yeah, no, it's a pleasure. I really appreciate your flying me out here for this.
Dude, of course. It was honestly my pleasure. And ladies and gentlemen, Murderabilia is out now. Please go buy this book. It is fantastic. A History of Crime in 100 Objects.
Could you point out that when they buy it, it won't come with a $100 bill bookmark?
No, this is movie money, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah. I wish it was real $100 bill. That would be cool if my bookmarkers were $100. Yeah. So everybody can find you at haroldschechter.com, but is there anywhere else that they could find your work?
Well, obviously you could buy the books on Amazon. But yeah, I think haroldschechter.com, which I never go on or look at, is the only site I have. Although people do contact me through there. I have somebody who runs the website and they forward me communications, which, I always respond to. So.
And why no social media? Last question.
75 years old, dude.
We want to see what sandwiches you're eating. Seriously, make an Instagram. Yeah. We'd love to reach out and.
I have to say, I'm not on Facebook. I'm not. I really, in some level, I'm not, like antisocial. I have friends and so on, but I have like no interest in being in contact. With like most people, even people I knew, when I went to college with and stuff. And, it seems so insanely, ridiculously time consuming. when I could be playing Resident Evil 4 on my PS5.
Yeah, real things.
Yeah, using things, spending my time fruitfully.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, Harold, you were amazingly generous today. I really appreciate
pleasure.
it. Thank you so much, man. And thank you guys for listening. Please follow us on Instagram at Talks from the Crypt or Twitter at TFTC Podcast. Peace.